For generations, the Canada-US border has stood as a powerful symbol of peace, cooperation, and economic partnership. Stretching thousands of miles, it is the longest, undefended border in the world, and for many, it represents a unique friendship between two nations. The Alaska Highway, constructed at breakneck speed during World War II, is far more than just a road. It's Alaska's primary land link to the lower 48 states. This vital artery carries goods, tourists, and families across the vast Canadian wilderness, connecting remote communities and supporting daily life in the north. This route is absolutely essential for Alaska's economy. Every day, long convoys of trucks haul everything from fresh produce and household goods to heavy oil equipment north through British Columbia and the Yukon, ensuring that Alaskans have access to the supplies they need. Without this overland connection, Alaskans would face soaring costs, as nearly all goods would have to arrive by sea or air, methods that are slower, more expensive, and less reliable, especially during harsh winter months. The highway also fuels a thriving tourism industry, drawing thousands of Americans and international visitors each year who are eager to explore the wild beauty of the north, from snow-capped peaks to endless forests. For decades, this free flow of people and commerce has been a quiet but powerful symbol of trust and mutual respect between the United States and Canada, allowing families, businesses, and cultures to connect seamlessly. But in early 2025, this lifeline was suddenly thrust into the spotlight, becoming the center of a tense dispute. Protectionist politics from Washington cast doubt on the once unquestioned passage, raising fears on both sides of the border. The conflict threatened not just critical supply chains, but also the spirit of cooperation and goodwill that had defined the relationship for nearly a century, putting livelihoods and communities at risk. As tensions rose, citizens on both sides watched anxiously, wondering if this historic route would remain a bridge between neighbors, or become a barrier that divides them for the first time in living memory. The crisis began when President Trump, in his renewed term, threatened a 25% tariff on all Canadian goods entering the U.S. This bold move was part of his broader strategy to protect American industries and reduce the trade deficit. However, the implications for Canada were immediate and severe. The shockwaves hit Canada hard, with industries from lumber to auto parts facing devastating consequences. Factories began to shut down, workers were laid off, and the economic stability of entire communities was threatened. The Canadian economy, heavily reliant on exports to the U.S., was suddenly in jeopardy. In response, Prime Minister Mark Carney's government prepared retaliatory tariffs, but the boldest move came from British Columbia. The provincial government knew they had to act swiftly and decisively to protect their interests and send a strong message to the U.S. Premier. David Eby announced that if tariffs were imposed, BC would consider tolls on all U.S. commercial traffic using its highways to Alaska. This was a strategic move, targeting a critical route for American goods and services. This targeted countermeasure put direct pressure on a critical American interest. The tolls would not only slow down the flow of goods, but also increase costs for American businesses relying on this route. Eby declared, "If they want a wall of tariffs, we'll build a gate, and that gate will have a toll." His statement resonated across Canada, symbolizing a new era of assertive economic policy. The move shifted the dispute from a general trade war to a specific high-stakes standoff. Negotiations became more intense, with both sides unwilling to back down. For the first time, a province was empowered to take such direct action, signaling a new, multi-layered Canadian defense. This unprecedented step showed the world that Canada was ready to defend its economic interests at all levels of government. The message was clear. Economic attacks on Canada would be met with precise, painful responses. The Canadian public rallied behind their leaders, showing solidarity in the face of economic aggression. The smooth passage to Alaska now hung in the balance, as both sides prepared for the next move. The stakes were higher than ever, with significant economic and political implications. The stage was set for a high-stakes confrontation. The world watched closely, waiting to see who would make the next move in this escalating trade conflict. British Columbia quickly backed its threat with action. On March 14, 2025, Premier Eby's government introduced the Economic Stabilization Tariff Response Act. The act didn't impose tolls immediately, but gave the cabinet authority to do so if U.S. tariffs became reality. It allowed BC to set tolls on key routes including the Alaska Highway and coastal ferries, with a built-in expiration in 2027. EB emphasized the goal wasn't to punish travelers, but to create consequences for U.S. trade aggression. Revenue from tolls would support BC businesses hurt by tariffs. The province also launched a Buy Canadian policy and banned certain U.S. liquors from government stores, adding symbolic weight to its stance. The act transformed a threat into a legally backed plan, showing BC was ready to retaliate. North America took notice. The Alaska Highway was now entangled in international politics. The dispute had become more than words, it was now law. President Trump's response was swift and incendiary, setting the tone for what would become a high-stakes confrontation between two close allies. His words, both in public and behind closed doors, left little doubt about his administration's willingness to escalate the situation. He denounced Canada's actions on social media, framing the tolls as an attack on American sovereignty. Tweets and statements from the White House quickly made headlines, fueling outrage among his supporters and putting pressure on Canadian officials to respond. Trump even floated the idea of military action to secure the Alaska route, escalating tensions further. While most saw this as political posturing, the mere suggestion of using force sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles and raised the stakes dramatically. Meanwhile, U.S. Senator Dan Sullivan of Alaska proposed waiving the Passenger Vessel Services Act, allowing cruise ships to bypass BC ports and sail directly from Washington to Alaska. This legislative move was designed to hit British Columbia where it hurt most, its lucrative tourism sector. This threatened BC's tourism industry, which relies on nearly 2 million cruise passengers each summer. Local businesses, from hotels to restaurants, braced for the potential loss of revenue, and community leaders voiced their concerns about the economic fallout. The U.S. had already set a precedent for waiving the law during the pandemic, making the threat credible. Memories of empty docks and shuttered terminals were still fresh, and the possibility of a repeat loomed large over the region. Trump also froze $31 million in U.S. funding for the Shockwalk Corridor, a key highway link through the Yukon. This move jeopardized vital infrastructure, threatening not just trade but also the daily lives of those who depended on the route. This signaled an end to cross-border cooperation on shared infrastructure as long as the toll threat remained. The message was clear: economic retaliation would be swift and far-reaching. The U.S. aimed to inflict symmetrical pain on BC, targeting both land and sea routes. Every move was calculated to maximize pressure and force a change in policy. The dispute had escalated from trade to a full-blown economic and diplomatic standoff. What began as a disagreement over tolls now threatened to unravel years of cooperation and goodwill. Both sides now held powerful levers, and neither seemed ready to back down. The world watched as negotiations stalled and rhetoric intensified, with each country digging in its heels. The stakes for Alaska, BC, and the entire border region had never been higher. The outcome of this standoff would shape not only the future of cross-border relations, but also the livelihoods of countless people on both sides. For Alaskans, the conflict was personal and immediate. The state's dependence on the land route through Canada made the threat of tolls alarming. The Alaska Trucking Association warned that new fees would drive up prices for everything from groceries to building supplies. State Senator Robert Myers highlighted the vulnerability of Alaska's supply chain, especially for perishable goods and the oil industry. Governor Mike Dunleavy urged federal leaders to resolve the dispute before Alaska suffered serious harm. Businesses scrambled to consider costly alternatives like sea or air freight, but these were impractical for many. The sense of isolation grew, as Alaskans realized how intertwined their fate was with Canada. Some lawmakers sought to build bridges, reaching out to Canadian counterparts for local solutions. For many, cooperation, not conflict, seemed the only way forward. The response to U.S. tariffs quickly became a national issue in Canada. Provinces across the country rallied behind British Columbia, forming a united front. Ontario, led by Premier Doug Ford, threatened a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to the U.S., targeting states reliant on Canadian power. The Yukon mirrored BC's measures, halting purchases from U.S. companies and limiting access to government contracts. Even small jurisdictions joined in, showing solidarity and reinforcing Canada's resolve. This coast-to-coast alliance made it clear, a threat to one province was a threat to all. The U.S. could no longer isolate BC. it now faced the full weight of Canadian federalism. The conflict had become Canada versus the United States. Amid the escalating threats, quieter efforts for diplomacy emerged. Alaska's legislature took the unusual step of reaching out directly to Canadian counterparts, seeking common ground. On March 24, 2025, the Alaska House passed a resolution supporting Canadian sovereignty and the historic friendship with BC and the Yukon. The resolution opposed tolls but emphasized reconciliation and mutual respect. Yukon Premier Ranj Pillai addressed Alaskan lawmakers, highlighting shared history and the need for partnership. This direct dialogue was a rare, constructive step toward local solutions. The resolution was sent to leaders in Washington and Ottawa, hoping to cool tensions. It was a reminder that, beneath the rhetoric, there was still a deep desire for cooperation. Beyond politics, the dispute had real human costs. For many, the border is part of daily life. Businesses, families, and communities depend on it. Alaskan small businesses faced razor-thin margins as freight costs threatened to soar. Families with members in Alaska and the lower 48 worried about more expensive, complicated travel. In BC, the threat to the cruise industry cast uncertainty over entire communities. The conflict strained cross-border friendships and traditions built over decades. The simple act of crossing the border now carried a sense of friction. The true cost was measured in disrupted lives and eroded trust. By June 2025, the standoff remained unresolved. The US hadn't imposed tariffs and BC hadn't activated tolls, a tense stalemate. The next move could escalate the conflict or open the door to peace. Diplomatic backchannels worked to find a face-saving solution, possibly trading tariff threats for a pause on retaliatory measures. Alaska's outreach showed an appetite for dialogue, offering hope for de-escalation. But if talks failed, a cascade of retaliation could devastate supply chains, tourism, and trust on both sides. Canadian officials stressed their actions were defensive, seeking stability. Many US leaders recognized the value of partnership with Canada. The hope was that pragmatism would prevail over protectionism. The future of the Alaska Highway, and the friendship it represents, hung in the balance.